Well, one thing I'm curious about now, having been to a few meetings, is there like uh, where does the agenda come from? Is it completely, individual proposed, like this is what I want to talk about, or is there like a document somewhere where we're kind of working our way through the document?
We're not
Um,
that organized, no.
Well, in
okay.
a way, we try to, right? So Tuesdays we try to have, and we have a document for Tuesdays, but I think Timothy abandoned it. So Tuesdays usually is Timothy, and then he wanted to have a top-down approach, let's call it, with not user stories, but yeah, just requirements. Going one by one with the smallest bits of requirements we can add on top of previous requirements to start building some agreement of requirements for yeah, whatever we can agree on. But we haven't touched that document in quite some time. I think we got sidetracked by other interesting things to talk about, let's assume. But then we had a document, and then on Fridays, it's with Marc-Antoine, where he wanted to primarily introduce this more mathematically, philosophically grounded, bigger abstraction that encompasses other things he wants to do, like including entities already. On Tuesdays, we weren't talking about entities yet, entities being a car. Like if you make a claim about a car, then you might also want to model the car in that claim. So that's what Marc-Antoine does on Fridays. Then on Wednesdays, we had Felix trying to introduce some talk about curation topics, but we only did that 2 or 3 meetings that we didn't have a document for that. But then a couple of weeks ago, I tried to introduce a document to have much more user-focused user stories listed. And we didn't touch that because I really want Timothy to be involved in those discussions. We've only listed 4 user stories there without defining any of the terminology used therein. And we were at the state where we're trying to see whether or not these user stories were actually talking about the same things. Because my primary focus would be to figure out whether we're actually trying to build the same thing by having a very user-centric list of user stories we primarily want to do. So we have several documents. We've abandoned some. But yeah, that's the general overview.
Yeah, and the only way we've kind of managed this many people in this many directions is each person kind of gets a benevolent dictator for a day of the week. And so they can do whatever they want, and they can shut people down and say, you do that on your day. That way we can stay somewhat focused.
Are these documents all in a particular folder or shared anywhere?
They're all in that drive, whether they're organized or not. I don't know if I know where they are in there.
Yeah, we haven't touched them in some time. The one you saw on Friday, the one that Marc-Antoine shared, is like the class diagram he does usually. He manages that, but I think it's shared on
Oh, GitHub? That may be GitHub, yeah.
Yeah. But let's find Timothy's overview. It's always such a mess to retrieve documents from Google Drive. Can't you start working for Google Drive instead of Teams?
Yeah, I might put in for a movement. What is the frustration?
It's better than any of the Microsoft tech. Let's put it that way.
It's just like the type of management you like organizing a folder and retrieving stuff. It just becomes so complicated if you have multiple accounts and you need to switch, log in, log out. It's a total mess. I don't know where any of my documents are that I've accumulated.
Between the accounts, not logging out and logging in. You can hit the upper right-hand corner and switch accounts. It's a little easier. And actually, I use a separate browser identity for each of my Google accounts.
I should probably do the same.
I eventually had to do that.
Is it a shared drive? No.
Are you looking
it's a shared
for
folder?
Yeah, I'm just even finding the CDL folder at this point.
Can you go to the Slack? I can just put the link in the Hangouts Slack.
Yeah, if you go up from there.
Yes. See, and now I'm there, but how the hell do I find that again?
So I would use the search. Do you think of a word that's...
I think I was searching for CDL and not canonical.
Well, I wouldn't search in the CDL folder for CDL.
No. I was looking for a D folder, but now I know.
Oh, the D folder.
I need to write it in full. Maybe we should add CDL in between brackets for easier searchability.
That's a good idea. Yeah. I'll rename it. I don't think we even need the brackets.
Okay, perfect. So yeah.
That's a good idea.
It should be, no, not scenarios. Where is Timothy's bottom-up use cases? I think is the one. Let me check. Yes.
Also seeing CDL user stories.
I think that's the one that I started recently. Let me check.
Yeah, there's 5 IDs in here.
Yep, that should be the one.
Felix.
So you can see if you compare the CD bottom-up use cases with CDL user stories, what I try to do with the CDL user stories is have more actual user stories. Primarily, I want to focus on the so that, because I want to incorporate the motivation for doing stuff inside of the user stories to see whether or not we're aligned. Why are we doing this? Rather than just having technical requirements for the sake of having technical requirements. I was hoping that by doing that, we can find more differences. When I say claim, is it really the same claim than when you say claim? Because the goal, what you're trying to achieve, might give slightly different meanings to that.
And by claim, you mean like the user story, right?
Yeah, how the word claim is used within the user story.
Oh, claim. Okay, how the claim's used in the user story. Gotcha.
So, and yeah, we haven't done any analysis other than just writing up some user stories that we all agree and understand. But yeah, at some point, I'd love to continue this. But yeah, again, we need Timothy for that. So you have the bottom-up use cases documents and
I'm looking at that one too, yeah.
So that's the one we made quite a bit of progress on. This one was more the goal here. So this was Tuesdays, guided by Timothy. And the goal here was to start building like was it a data model or an entity model? A bit of both. Yeah, the goal was to progressively modify a model to include new requirements, which are then the use cases, the requirements list. And each time we added one, we all agreed and we marked it as completed. And I think why we got sidetracked is probably because we ran into some, more complicated cases. I think probably composite claims, I think, is where we deviated again.
And I think we realized we had different definitions of claim.
Yeah.
And other stuff like that.
Yes.
So, Stephen, you kind of also mentioned working on going back to a glossary or dictionary.
What actually I'm suggesting with the CDL user stories is going back to a glossary. Except that rather than just introducing words for the sake of adding words to a glossary, they come from use cases. That's the only difference. So to even make the step before why you want to add stuff in a glossary more explicit. But it's essentially the same thing, because once you have a set of user stories, you need to shape them to use the same language, shared understanding of the language used within those user stories. And those things that we decide, well, if you want to make clear that 3 user stories are talking about the same thing, it's really good to use the same name for that thing in all 3 user stories. Once we decide on that, my hope is to add them back into a glossary. And we could do that similar to the Trello board that I made last time. I can
or just another tab in the, if we want to keep it all together.
Yeah, no, actually true. Yeah, it can just be another tab inside the same document, which I think I already created. Yeah, actors and entities. Yeah. Yeah, the reason I added the Trello glossary was more to keep track of new people joining. So people at any given time can more easily disagree. But I think we can easily do the same thing with columns in Excel.
Okay, what is the Trello? Would that be easy to share?
Yeah, let me find it. CDL glossary. Do it to Trello. Too many Trello boards. Argument modeling glossary. I generally have too much information fragmentation. It's funny because I studied it for my PhD to find solutions for that. And
that's why you're so good at it.
You're so familiar with the problem. You have to be intimately familiar with your problem to
really commit it.
So this is the glossary. Can you exit it, Carl?
Let's see. Clicking now.
Probably need an invitation.
I may not be logged in either, so it's been a while. Oh, it's my
invites.
Lock. Yeah, this board may be private, board not found.
What is your surname?
G-I-E Ringer. R-I-N-G-E-R, Geringer.
I'm not finding you here. Oh.
Carl.Geringer@gmail.
At CarlGG, is that you?
No, not Carl GG. Sorry, let me just put it in the...
But when I search for your email, it pops up at CarlGG as your handle.
Oh, that's possible. Sorry. I think that sounds... I vaguely recall using that as the username. I'm about to log in. I can confirm that if you're concerned, or you can just shoot that person a... Your account has been updated. Please check your email to continue using Trello. Okay. Must have reset their password. Whatever. Hashing. Action required. I've forgotten that Trello was an Atlassian product.
They got taken over.
Yeah.
It wasn't before. It was same people from
I think it's been a couple years since they were bought.
Yes, Carl GG is my handle. Sorry that it took so long to confirm that.
Yeah, and if you open a board, you can also instantly see a problem we ran into there. And actually, it's a recurring problem. It relates to the bottom-up and top-down approach, where Timothy and I both want to have very basic fundamental building blocks to start building upon, be it from a glossary or from a data model. Mm-hmm. You can see that Mercant1 has the opposite. He wants to introduce, well, you can see how many definitions he added. It's with his picture added to it. It's like, okay, let's add a definition. What we decided to is have each, if a definition relies on another definition, then you need to add 2 cards basically on Trello. So in order for him to add his most fundamental glossary items he wanted to introduce, he added to add like 15, which kind of, hampers the process, because all of a sudden you don't have just one glossary item you need to try to agree on, you have 20.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of kind of circularity to this too, because that means the human brain to some degree is kind of like meaning depends on meaning, but like this meaning only exists because that thing had meaning before. And so that's kind of a theoretical statement, what I'm saying right now, but I can understand why trying to completely define this problem theoretically would require a lot of initial symbols. I think it's kind of one of the reasons that I kind of want to avoid entirely, a mathematical style description, because I think it's just so hard to do.
Yeah, it's
whereas
too
I think
rigid.
a practical approach would make progress, even though you don't know exactly what you're doing. And I know that may not appeal to like the full academics, but I think it may be it may be a way to get things done before, and you learn things, right? Like if you do your perfect theoretical description, but you get like a couple things wrong, fundamental things wrong, and you build off of that, like yes, these are rock solid assumptions. Well, then you get to this point where, oh shoot, this is different. And like, how hard is it to redo that? I don't know. It depends on.
Yeah. System, so the process here, the idea was indeed that any glossary item that was confirmed at some point can always go back based on new discussions that arise. It was just more to keep track of which terminology are we using at this point in time, because it changes a lot, as you have already discovered in just 2 meetings or so, right? And it is very important. I think it is one of the main bottlenecks we have. We all share the same goal. There's no problem there. We all want to achieve the same thing, but we have different use cases in mind, or different priorities is another way of putting it. I think we all want to do everything, but we have different priorities of achieving those goals. And I don't think they all are the same system. So when we always say the system, the backend, I think the main problem we have is that we're not talking about the same thing. And it would be very nice if we can separate these discussions, and we can continue having all of them. But so in domain-driven design, this is what is called bounded contexts. Like within a bounded context, you define a glossary, the ubiquitous language you use to talk about these things. You define the use cases. And I hope to identify multiple of these by having more user-oriented user stories. Yeah, everyone needs to be here to do that. Otherwise, it kind of defeats the purpose.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, we have many attempted documents. So if you have experience with any other approach or something, I think at this point we're still open to have more structure. I think it's not that we don't like structure, it's more that we haven't really found a structure that works for us that well yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have an initial idea, but or overarching idea, but some things that are just occurring to me are like time boxing certain activities. Like, we will have this done, in a month, or we will have this defined this week. And, to the degree that there is not consensus reached around that, like, I don't know, then I guess the team kind of has to make a judgment call. Like, do we really, because if you continuously spend forever working on, certain definitions, like it may be 5 years, I don't know, before something's done. And I don't think anyone wants that, or at least I certainly don't want to wait that long to do something.
It's an interesting thing, because one thing Marc-Antoine kind of brings up is that we all have, and lots of other people have created tools, have experimented with it. And I think Steven agrees with this, that we're kind of beyond that. For many of the areas, we're on that point of building something, putting it out, and getting iterative feedback, because we found out there were some fundamental problems, and now we're trying to figure out those fundamentals. Now, I still think there's some unexplored areas in that, and that's why I'm doing Dolibot, and Steven, I think, has a couple more. So I think we're still running these experiments on the side. So there is the balance between, I almost think doing it two-pronged is maybe one of the days should be focused on getting experiments out there, and the other one being focused on the long-term goals. But Marc-Antoine definitely seems to have a vision that he wants to tackle. And he feels the early experiments have been mostly done, I think.
Yeah, that kind of brings up a question for me around experimentation and your user base. What is the feeling of the people? What's the what's I'm looking for, like the temperature of the room for sort of wide open, as in like Reddit style, anyone can join this platform, versus a more targeted approach, like let's try and recruit researchers because people with PhDs have reputations to uphold, but then they're also highly analytical, or let's focus on reporters, or let's do a sort of exclusive invite type system so that yes, like anyone could technically join, but it's limited to people who are sort of growing outwards from it's passing through people who know each other, so there's going to be like a higher level of cohesion, integrity, and trust, we would hope. And also there would be a feeling of sort of like, oh, cool, I got this exclusive invite to this system at some point. Have you all talked about any of those things?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, that's a good thing. We talk a lot, but that also gives us a very good understanding of where we all are. And this is a nice example. We call it the crowdsourcing versus like curation division. I think we referred to it at one point. The majority of the people you have talked to so far, they aim to do crowdsourcing. Yes, I think all of them. The primary person that doesn't do that right now, and whose primary goal that isn't, you haven't met, and that's Jamie from the Society Library. So she really focuses more on a highly curated, like people that know the correct process to follow, etc. Her goal is not to open it up to the public. And she works together with Stefan, I guess you pronounce. You haven't met him yet. He doesn't typically attend these meetings, but he's on Slack. And that's the creator of, I keep calling it debate graph, but yeah, debate map.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and one thing about that is that I think most everyone would eventually, it's a priority issue. I think even Jamie will always want a curated set by experts, but she would love to interact with a crowdsourced version.
True.
And for me, Golibot, eventually I'd want it to be fully crowdsourced, but it is until those, and so that's the way Golibot and Society Library, we're moving forward with the tools as they are doing experiments in public on different ideas. But I think even when we start doing the crowdsourced, this is such a our goal is to reduce contention and division, right? So anything we do is going to be divisive. So I don't think there'll ever, that it'll have to be pretty mature before we just open it up without invite.
Yeah, and just feedback. I agree. I think with that sentiment, Bentley, as I understood it, and yeah, Stephen, just to make sure I was clear about at least my, to some degree, I was saying like here's possible options, but to some degree, it was also kind of like here's also what I'm kind of thinking might be good options. Is I don't think crowdsourcing is mutually exclusive with curation, at least in my thinking, because you can grow a community through the more curator type people, but then you can open it, over time to a wider group of, to a quote crowdsourced open group. And I think that choice matters because the initial temper of the community, I think, has a huge impact on how it grows. And if you end up with like just open it up and you get a bunch of like messiness, it's like, oh my gosh, this is just a place to like troll people. But if you open up to people who have reputations and who care about information, and then you like slowly introduce additional people, I think that can.
Yeah, exactly. That's a Stack Overflow model that they also followed. They wrote a blog post about that many years ago, and it's the same model that I was following with like doing private. Like I don't just accept anyone on Socrates. The main reason is I'm not experimenting with crowdsourcing at this point. I'm still experimenting with the data structures and whether or not people want to use them. Can you use them? Can you add stuff? I'm not that. I mean, even though I have a long-term goal of achieving crowdsourcing, that's not what my iterative experiments are about right now. But long-term, I think we're all aligned that we want to get there. And yes, they're definitely not mutually exclusive. One of the big bounded context discussions I was trying to aim for is that I think curation is a whole separate bounded context from actual, what I would call is like the core argument modeling, the stuff, the argument database, like having a central repository of what we can agree on, how to model it, for me is a different use case than how to decide who gets to manipulate it and through which actions you manipulate it, etc. So I was arguing for a long time that we should just decouple these to have discussions about one, and then have curation be a separate use cases and discussions. And I always argue that...
I'll be right back. Sorry, I'll be right back. I'm listening, but I have to...
Okay. And for me, the dependency points from the curation domain model or bounded context relying on the underlying, I don't know what we call it, the modeling boundary context. And that always received a lot of objection from Marc-Antoine, who doesn't believe that they can be separated. That he thinks they're one and the same. And that's still a conflict we have to this date.
Yeah. I seem to think there is some value gained in being able to transfer the current state of an argument without history and without curation capability.
For me, it's just merely from a software engineering perspective. If you want to maintain your sanity, it's nice to decouple these as well. And from a social perspective, if we each want to do different things with curation, we need to decouple it if we ever hope to agree on the modeling, the latest state of the argument, whatever model.
Yeah, and I don't know if that gets back to Marc-Antoine's thrust, is that he thinks, even though we don't have that solidified, that his interest is in how do people compare debate graphs and debate it. So that's his main focus. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah. Go ahead, Carl. Did you say something? Maybe not.
Oh, sorry. I was. So I just want to make sure I understood correctly. So, so did you say Marc-Antoine was sort of opposed to separating the representation and the storage and the structure of the claims from a conversation around curation?
Yes.
And community building. Okay, interesting. Yeah. To me, it's not clear why there'd be a conflict.
in his mind, the core principle of this is that two people have two different debate maps, and the curation process is interleaving and finding agreement between those maps. So when you disagree, you're building another map. Now, I guess I still think should be a way to separate those.
In essence, I think so too. I mean, the two different maps would be what we call the representational, whatever, by lack of a better name. I like how you call it, Carl. And then there would be another one context subsystem that just takes care of like integrating many different representations. And whether or not you decide that there's only just one representation that everyone modifies, or you have some federated architecture that allows integrating many different. But yeah, his point there is, of course, that if your federated architecture can only integrate many different representations, if those representations contain certain formalisms, like entities and properties of entities formalized in claims, then I do see his point. So I think he wants to formalize a lot because when he envisions these mechanisms to merge opposing views, he wants to do so on the really highly mathematical modeled substance of what claims are.
Yeah, and he may also be thinking that decisions in the space of that comparison are going to affect the model. Although I don't mind adjusting the model when we find those out. It'd still be nice to have kind of a base model at this point.
And also, it begs the question, if it's a separate bounded context, which I still think it is, you typically don't want to pollute another model for use case of this separate bounded context. And that's why I always said, for me, the formalisms that I needed to do like more intricate merging live outside of the base model. And you can always link back to them, right? I mean, that's where that whole discussion comes from.
And maybe the way to phrase it is to say, let's have a data model for representing a snapshot of an unformalized argument. And then formalization is a separate context, and then combining formalizations is a separate context. And then we don't get into the problem with, because Marc-Antoine's will change the formalization, but probably won't affect the base model. Guess we lost Carl.
Yeah. So I agree with that approach as well. Yeah. And I think he agrees with it in theory, but I don't think he believes it's possible in practice. And that's where, but yeah, we're not going to solve this now. But that's just a summary for you, Carl. Some of the main disagreements we have right now.
I don't know if you noticed, but I lost connection.
Yeah,
so the last maybe 60 seconds, I'll have to look at the recording, or if you
Bentley just paraphrased the same thing, but you can say it again, Bentley. It was a nice summary.
Yeah, I was saying that maybe rather than the way to say it is, we want a kind of a base model that doesn't even have formalization, and then the base model, the formalization, and then not curation. What is it? The crowdsourcing kind of management piece would be three separate things, because Marc-Antoine's concerned that changes in the model of formalization and will affect the base model. But I think if the base model doesn't include any formalizations whatsoever, then it's unlikely that there will be changes that replicate through. And if there are, we're growing iteratively, so I don't think changing the base model is a bad thing. But
just having a base model at this point would be nice. That's another thing that I've been suggesting for some time, right? We also need to just, rather than having lengthy descriptions, just implement the base model. I like entity diagrams and UML. It has its limitations. It really doesn't take a lot of time to write some basic classes and stuff that represent the same thing, and that actually works. Because I mean,
yeah, but first of all, you already did, right? We can just point it at Socrates and say and say done.
But you don't agree with, we don't share the same base model assumptions. I mean, the thing is that it would only model what we all agree on, right? And then iteratively expand on that.
Yeah, I'd like to see that, because a few of us might change. I mean, I could change. I already know Gullybot doesn't match what we would agree on as the base model. And if I'm going to have to rewrite the code again, it'd be nice to throw that in. So just say what's the minimum that we agree on, but without maybe and limit it to say no formalizations, because that, I think that's where we open up the can of worms.
Well, I think, the can of worms is already open with that phrase, because my understanding of our definition of formalization apparently is not matching at this point what we meant by formalization. Like, it's a term we also never defined. And I think the use of the term has changed over time, because like my understanding of formalization or incremental formalization was there's some minimum amount that the user is required to enter, and maybe that's just a sentence. And that any improvements you make after that are what I consider to be incremental formalization.
Improvement or edits. We talked about this before.
Yeah, I mean, but
improvements, additions,
I didn't consider
or replacements.
Like, well, I think if you edit the grammar of the sentence, I don't consider that an incremental formalization necessarily. I do consider it an improvement, but not necessarily a formalization, incremental formalization. Whereas disambiguation is something I consider part of an incremental formalization. It's something the original submitter didn't take the time to do in the beginning, and so left it more nebulous. And then you're adding some formal specifications to it, but it's not the same thing as changing the structure of the argument for multi-premise and things like that, which are different structures. But I still consider adding disambiguations a step on formalization.
Yeah, and then the big question we always have there is, do you keep the old one or not? Like, when you add it, do you copy and add like extra formalizations to the same phrasing, or do you just modify the original, which has more to do with whether we want to have immutable claims, etc.
And that's one that I've given in on in terms of, like, I won't argue against it, because I think any of my arguments against it are more empirical. So I'm okay with doing it that way and then seeing how it goes, as opposed to spending time.
And you can still filter out the ones you don't want to show, right? So it doesn't really rule out your revision either. If you say the original one was bad, then you can add some extra, within your concern, you can add some extra flags to say don't show this.
Wait, so which approach are you acquiescing to, Tim? The immutable or mutable approach?
I will allow the immutable approach, because in my vision, yes, the graph is immutable or can be done as immutable, but like, I do want there to be a view on what is the current state of the graph, which means there's a view, which is the default view, which is how it looks right now, which puts all the like fixes or pre-formalization versions in the past, and leaves the formalized view as what people are interacting with.
This is an interesting use case you should try to add if we ever pick up the use case discussions that I introduced on Wednesdays, because for me, that's really a filter on top of other data, and your use case will determine, like, how do you decide which ones to show and which ones not to show. And I think if we dig deeper into that, we'll uncover some more different approaches, and maybe meaning different things here, because you'll need data to know which ones you want to show and which ones you don't want to show. When you say the last state, what is the last state? So there's going to be some cutoff point for you where you say, this I want to show and that one I don't want to show. The whole reason I want immutable claims is I claim that you cannot arbitrarily decide that. Well, you can, but I don't think we can all agree on how to decide that. So I think that a base system shouldn't decide that, and other systems building on top of the base system can then decide which subset of things to show.
So I think a question that gets to the crux of that is, how do you handle changing or improving the original text?
Well, I guess
that's a valid question.
Right, but in the, like, what I'm calling the base model, which is bad, that's out of scope.
That's all what?
Out of scope.
Well,
so we don't want to have edits where there's no history, there's no nothing. What's just the current state? how do we want to associate claims? Because there's a couple of questions still there that I think it'd be valuable for us to at least throw something at the wall and see if it sticks.
So I by no means what I'm going to say next, I don't have any hard opinions on it. I can only share what I do now. For me, I allow textual edits as long as claims are not reused, because it doesn't affect anything. Like if the problem is, once a claim is reused elsewhere, then I don't want to allow edits, because it has gotten context and you cannot easily edit one without considering whether or not you want to edit the others. The meaning might change by doing an edit in another place. And that's what I want to avoid.
But then how do you handle post hoc deduplication in a base layer?
That would be maintaining two immutable claims and saying this one is a duplicate of the other one. That would have to be modeled on a base layer level then.
So
otherwise,
you do need
it's impossible.
That on the base model of an association of equivalence of some sort.
Yes, I do think we need that on a base model, yes. That is definitely, for me, within scope of what I would call a base model we hopefully can share.
I just think it'd be nice to start with something even smaller. Like, do we agree that, you know, the claims are like the whole issue of, you know, if you claim and then you have claims, are those pros and cons, or are they just this claim is associated to the other claim? I mean, maybe those other decisions will change it broadly, and I'm just being starting too small, but it just seems like it'd be nice to say, how do you do a snapshot, an uneditable snapshot of an argument? What's the model of that? And just strings and associations.
Yeah, but then we have to talk about what you mean by argument here. And this is why the use cases are so important. Because for me, that snapshot is not an argument. It's a collection of all the different arguments that have ever been made in relation to that claim. So,
well, yeah, right. So it depends on which definition of argument.
Yes, exactly.
But I'm saying like a tree of claims that has no history and no editability.
Yeah, but so it fully, what that snapshot should be is fully determined by what use case you want to support. Like, what are you going to use the tree for? So we really first need to try to identify those, and then we can agree on a shared tree structure. I think that's the main problem that we have, is like when we're introducing new things, like indeed, like do we want to show is a duplicate off link, or if there's no, if we don't agree on immutability, then there's going to, of course, be a different opinion on, do you want to model two different claims and have links between them and saying these are duplicates, or do you just assume that you only always edit the original claim in your final model?
I'm just saying, I just want to represent claims and their pros and cons in a tree. No editing, no changing. No, so it doesn't matter. You're never going to have an edit. So.
Okay, and then you want to
just
later
a data transfer of a snapshot in time. That the whole thing is immutable, and it's just one main claim, and it's tree of pros and cons.
But I mean, there's no real challenge there.
No, but I think
I think there's some unanswered questions in there. But
like the use case you're getting at is you want the data transfer, you want sharing of data between systems, right? And that's the goal of this model you want, which is very different from.
Or just displaying it on my website and having a display.
Yeah, but that's not a valid use case. I mean, you can't have it postpones the discussion on what it is like that. Why do you want to show something?
Everything about organization is postponing discussions. That's what organizing a conversation is about.
But
I think it's a valid use case.
Agreement on. Like, do you want to show like a graph? Do you want to show like what I do in Socrates? Do you want to show negations or not? It's just because.
No, but that's the thing, is I'm not assuming agreement. I'm proposing the smallest nugget, and then I'm saying, is that right? So, you know, do we want to include pro cons in it, or is it just literally a tree? These are the children. I use children, which no one likes, but go ahead, Carl.
So, having listened out to a few, you know, not a lot, but at least a few of these meetings, what's occurring to me is that I think something that this team is likely to agree on is going to be something very generic initially, and we start with something very generic, and then like we try to talk about what we can add to it. And so have you talked about using a graph structure? I mean, I know you've talked about it because I've seen you guys talk about graph databases, but like figure out what are the nodes, what is a claim, and I'd propose that like a symbol, like just a run of text in a particular language could be a claim. I think this group could agree on like a symbol. Some people might not call it a claim because to them a claim has to have some formalism attached, like this entity attached to this entity, but like a run of text in some language, that's the node. And then just start adding relations to that. And like, what are the relations that the group can agree are in the base model? What are the groups of relations that the group think is out of the base model? And, there may be, I don't know what's what I'm looking for, like filtering, efficiencies on top where, this subgraph is, aggregated into a single node for this particular use case because this person doesn't care about edit history, or this person doesn't care about this other thing, or this platform doesn't care about it. But I think like a node, a graph, start with a graph structure, like what can we agree the nodes are, and then what and then look at each type of relation we might add initially, and then where do we draw this line of agreement.
I think that's what we did on Timothy's Tuesdays. So the document we shared with you before, the CD bottom-up use case, I think that's what we tried to do there, exactly that. Okay. Except that we kept it in a verbal form, not in a implemented form. Although, like one of the early cases, I think I implemented in Kotlin actually. One of the. What do people think
about that? Has it been discussed? This idea of just using runs of text in a particular language, of that being the atom, the nodes of this graph? Or?
Yeah, I have problems with that, and I think I could break it down into two things. One is that I think as a minimum, we want to not start from scratch as if we're creating this idea out of thin air, but rather start from a point of whatever we do has to be an incremental improvement on what's already out there. And the main example we use is Kialo. It's like, we've got to do better than Kialo, right? And we know we have a list of deficiencies in Kialo that we all want to resolve, right?
One is that recorded?
It's not concisely recorded.
And I know from shortly talking with you, Carl, that I don't think you agree with these deficiencies. So that's an interesting topic. We might go into it the last 10 minutes.
I don't know if you disagree with it or if you started from a different objective, which is what I looked at, is you were looking at a different goal with the work you were doing as opposed to the canonical debate, which is what we're trying to do. Like deduplication of claims is an essential component of making the debate canonical. And I think that's something that all the members of the CDL agree on. It's something that Kialo doesn't do. Another part of that is, and that's difficult because to do deduplication, you need at least one of two things, and I want to see both, which is a curation method of how do you propose that two claims are identical and how do you agree that they're equivalent and do the merge or whatever it takes. So that's one part of it. And the other part is, is there a way to sort of automate this, or what, is there a way you can define what makes, a claim and what makes it unique? Or I say sometimes, what are the primary keys of a claim, right? We all agree it's not the sentence, it's not the text itself, because any claim, the same idea can be said in multiple ways. And one statement can also, in other words, there's a many-to-many relationship between a sentence and claim, right?
Okay.
So that's not the primary key for a claim. And we haven't fully gotten down into what that is.
So first of all, I totally agree. So just so you know, I'm coming from, I think, a very similar perspective as you. Like that one of my primary, complaints with Kialo is that the claims are not deduplicated and that arguments are siloed, and like that's not a system I want. The reason that I'm so interested in using runs of text as the atoms or the nodes, or at least why I was proposing it. Sorry, I shouldn't say that I care much about this. It's just an idea. Although I do think it's consistent with my thinking on the matter, is that that's the one thing that I don't think people are going to disagree a lot about. It's like those are the things that are out there, and some of those are just deficient. Like there's a I don't want, now this one I wouldn't say is deficient, but let's take the example of the phrase Black Lives Matter. that run of text means so many different things. Well, maybe not so many, but it means several different things to several different people. And it's just controversial. Like people at this point, people just aren't going to agree about that if that's a claim. It's just, there's just going to be too much back and forth. And so it's, in a sense, it's a deficient claim for the purpose of, finding communal sense of meaning. It's just too controversial now. So what I think, if that's one of the nodes in the system, it's like, okay, but this node has been, determined to be basically not useful for getting people to talk reasonably, however you would arrange that. And there need to be alternate nodes. Like, okay, you should look at this node because this is the one that, means kind of the same thing as this Black Lives Matter node, but it, is it's phrased in a way that people from various viewpoints can actually talk, about it without getting incensed and blowing up. So maybe I hope that makes sense. And as far as like what's the unique ID of a claim, like that, in my opinion, the unique ID of a claim exists in every single head, every brain looking at the claim, and that makes it an intractable problem. Like you can't identify the claim, just there's the run of text, and then you have to try and figure out, okay, well, what's the runs of text that people talk meaningfully about versus the ones that they just don't talk meaningfully about.
I think I agree, and that's what your definition of claim here, Carl, I think aligns better with what I call a standalone claim, whereas Timothy's definition of a claim, as in the way I hear it, an additional, I would call it canonical claim. It's like a more like a good claim formalized to a degree where it becomes more useful. So it's not efficient, as Carl called it. And I think they're two different things, and they're probably modeled separately. Or the way I approach this, for me, a claim doesn't have an identity, or every claim is fully identified by what is formalized. Like all claims are standalone. If you have a standalone claim that only has text, that full text is the equality. If you do some incremental formalization that you actually define within that run of text, like one of the entities, that is no longer the same claim than the undefined just run of text without the entity information added to it. And then you just do an equality check on the additional entity information to see whether or not that is the same that another one with additional formalization, etc. So for me, the identity of a claim is simply everything that is modeled. It's a full equality check of everything that is modeled in the standalone claim, if that makes sense. So for me, a run of text definitely is the identity if there's nothing more.
That kind of makes sense, but I don't quite understand how you would deal with ambiguous terms. Like, let's say you have a run of text, and I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but
Black Lives Matter.
Okay. So what would
or
be?
Paris
what would
is
be?
Nice.
Okay, Paris is nice. Are they talking about Paris in France? Or are you talking about Paris, the other Paris? I think we just talked about this. Like, how does the system handle Paris is nice? Like, I mean, that's maybe a bad example because almost everyone would assume we're talking about Paris, the romantic, well-known global city in France. But it's possible that if you live in like Idaho, you think maybe someone's talking about Paris, Idaho, or wherever it is.
Or
so,
if you're socialite,
how do you?
But so to the system. Sorry, go ahead, Bentley.
It depends on the context. A lot of people would be talking about Paris Hilton, not Paris, France.
Oh, right. Good. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the whole point of a standalone claim is if it's not modeled, it's not modeled, but it has its own identity and it is ambiguous. And that is the identity of that claim. It's an ambiguous Paris. You don't define it.
Okay. So like, I think that's really interesting. And I think we could work with that where standalone claim, I would just call standalone claim. I would throw away the word standalone claim, which has created much confusion. I would call it statement. And what you're saying is you want to have debates on statement in the same way you have debates on let's call it canonical claim, right? And that's interesting. And I think we could work with that.
That's a fundamental functionality of the base layer. And then I think other layers can decide or guide people to the canonical claims, the better ones to talk about, because we also agree there. But what they fundamentally share is the same ability that you can discuss it. And when you should move to a canonical claim or not, I think is subjective. But
then I would say, for that, the primary key of statement is the text itself, right? That's it. But at some point, people are going to want to, and so this is a question of what is the function of the base layer? What are the use cases? Because at some point, people are going to want to, I guess they have to add a new statement then, right? Which instead of keeping the sentence simple, is going to, and using disambiguation, because with canonical, the way I see canonical claims is you can have Black Lives Matter repeated 100 different times with disambiguation. So it's Black Lives Matter, you know, by Black Lives, by matter. Well, this is a hard one, because what you're really saying from that is that, you know, I'm going to guess how somebody from Black Lives Matter, the organization, would state it, but say something that there is a clear institutional racism that creates a much higher incidence of mortality for Black people than other people in American society for the same crimes. I don't know how they would put it, but they would say something like that, right? And then you would have essentially what all lives matter, their rebuttal would be. When you say all lives matter as a rebuttal to that, you're actually saying that singling out a single subgroup creates a division or racism that you're trying to avoid when you're trying to say that every single life is important, right? What you should be saying is every single life is important, and that includes Black people. It's a fantastic example. I think we're going to use it over and over again, Carl. Thank you. But it's actually one that's extra hard to specify. So let me do Paris is nice, right? You have the same sentence, Paris is nice, over and over again, and you would have in the canonical claims, you could just say Paris is nice over and over again and have a disambiguation that says Paris, France, the city. And by nice, we mean a good place to visit on vacation for anybody, right? But you could also have by nice, you mean the weather is always pleasing in the summer or something. You can have lots of disambiguations for nice. So you have the same claim, but it's not the same concept every time, even though the words are the same. Whereas in the base layer, a statement, I think in order to disambiguate, you need to create new claims with all those words, because there's no shortcuts.
Well, yes and no. I mean, yeah. So you can elaborate, but the interesting relation between these two, and nice is a nice example in this one, is that different people have different arguments for why Paris is nice, and that is valid. You might at some point not want to split that discussion, because the whole arguments that you're trying to have is whether or not it's nice, and then you don't want to split up that whole discussion with 10 different definitions of nice, because essentially they're creating echo chambers about nice. Well, if you only allow the specific definitions, that is, and of course neither of us wants to do that, I think.
It gets down to what you were saying, different use cases, and now I understand your use case really is just seeing, you want to collect the different interpretations, essentially.
Because different interpretations might be disagreement, yes.
Well, yeah, but
might be the root of disagreement.
My use case is I want to eliminate those stupid disagreements so that people could argue the substance of, you know, by nice, if you mean that the weather is good in summer, let's focus on that and answer that one question. And there are different use cases, right? Okay, so I think for me, and I have a hard stop, unfortunately now, for me, take away from this that I would be happy changing the name from standalone claim, which is, you know, thrown into lots of back and forth with Marc-Antoine, to calling it statement. If the primary key really is text and it's immutable, I would call it statement. And then a canonical claim is not fully defined yet, but I think there's an understanding that whatever makes the primary key of the concept It would be the concept as the primary key rather than the words used to express the concept. And however we can specify that in the system, I would want to see that.
But it would be inherently, it would inherently be undefined, right? So it's more like a goal, because I mean, it's by editing it that you formalize the concept better. Because if
well,
you,
I want
there
to
can be disagreement on what the concept means. There can be disagreement on what the concept means, and that's
okay. But that gets into the two kinds of ambiguity, right? First of all, I want to allow incremental formalization, meaning what I mean by that is I want to allow the average person to come in and contribute a claim that is usable in the canonical debate without having to go through the exercise of figuring out what is every single concept I'm doing here. They throw that out and somebody comes in and says, oh yeah, this isn't, let's figure out what's meant here. And I don't, and I don't think that the original contributor has to be the one to do that disambiguation of adding the definition, defining the concept, because when the person's wrong, all you do is you create two copies. It's every possible variation of the concept, which may be highlighted by the differing arguments attached to an ambiguous statement, right, are pointing to different concepts. Yeah. But anyway, I would want to, so there's two kinds, like I said, of ambiguity. There's the nobody specified the concept, and there's the concept itself is ambiguous, right? And I want to formalize up to the point that everything's been specified, but I'm okay with debating an ambiguous concept once the concept.
That's a subjective decision. That's kind of my point.
No, it's not subjective. It's not subjective. It's literally every single element of the disambiguation. I would be happy if it were.
You can fully specify it and make it highly specific and disambiguated, but by doing so, by making it more formalized, you rule out any discussions underneath it that people might want to be talking about. My point is, yeah, sure. Then you split the discussions, the disagreement in two different highly specialized, formalized statements. But sometimes it's meaningful not to do that if the disagreement that is being had is exactly about the ambiguous concepts. Like, how do you, if you only have the two specific ones, where is the link to the ambiguous form? That's the whole purpose of the ambiguous form, is that it can link to more specific claims.
Yeah, but those links are generally going to be, the links are going to be in what we've talked about, general to specific.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those links happen along what I would like to see as some kind of knowledge graph or relation graph between the elements of the concepts. And they maintain a relationship. But you understand that there's a difference between the ambiguity in Paris is nice with no disambiguation. And
there is, I understand it, but it's not always that clear cut. This is a nice example where everyone will agree, but it's not always that clear cut. Like but the racism example I gave was a nice one.
No, Paris is nice is a good example because you can create really ambiguous definitions of the word nice, right? Sure, Paris is going to be assigned to the city Paris or the person Paris Hilton or whatever. That is not ambiguous. But
it's
nice,
a clear case where it isn't ambiguous. But my question is, who decides it?
Wait, let me finish. The definition of nice is always going to be somewhat ambiguous. It depends on how much you put into your definition of nice, how easy it is to evaluate. But if you say, my definition of nice is, it's a pleasing place to visit.
But the same applies for Paris, Timothy. You can also talk Paris like the metropolitan or the more with including the suburbs.
Okay, right. So, but I would accept Paris, the city in France, as the disambiguation. And then you get into, but do you mean the metropolitan area or you do whatever? And you would create a general to specific relationship where now we're just talking about the metropolitan region and now we're talking about the larger region.
But which one do you use in the original discussion?
There are three different discussions now.
You don't.
You have the discussion on the ambiguous more ambiguous term and discussion on each ambiguous term, and you can use them as arguments. But
no, but that's why we started. We said, let's presume France is nice. And then I say, yeah, because Paris is nice. And you say, no, we need to disambiguate this. This is not clear enough. So my whole question is, who is going to decide how much it is ambiguate Paris here?
Each person's decision to disambiguate creates a new debate.
Exactly.
And I know you're concerned about siloing, and so we need to discuss that. But the proposal is there to
have relationships between the concepts, and part of the support of the system would have to be every time you bifurcate, you make a copy of the arguments, you make new links to the new debates, and then you can talk about the relevance of each one of those.
So all of them would be listed.
And it goes more than that, because if you want to contribute a new argument to the top level one that's more ambiguous, immediately it raises the question, should this also appear on the other two? So the system needs to support doing that easily and quickly, but that's how I want to see the debates going on with disambiguation, because like in the example of immigration, it's useful to know immigration in this region versus immigration in that region, slice it by what kind of immigration and what kind of immigration, these all feed into it, but they are somehow still feeding into and relevant to the larger discussion. Mm-hmm. So that's, I have to go, I have a hard stop, my meeting already started and I'm late, but yeah, this was I think productive, and I wish we could keep going.
Hi, Tim.
Next
see you on
time.
Friday.
See you.
Hi.
Yeah, the generic specific is another one that we generally do agree on, but there's different approaches to doing this and different requirements on which ones to retain or how they are linked and etc. Which might all depend on the use case as well.
Yeah, and I didn't take time to correct, but I misspoke, and Tim went on thinking I was talking about limiting the base layer, but I was just talking about what's the first step in iterating towards the base layer. So, what's our first use case basically that we're going to start modeling off of?
Linking runs of text to one another that can be reused. That's for me, but that's what I already did, right?
Well, but do you, after all these discussions, do you still like your model?
Yeah, I mean, no, that there's many things that need to change. I need to formalize context. I need to start formalizing.
Specifically for me, it's the pro-con, because the way I handled it is vastly different from the way we've been discussing it. So I think that'd be a good place to, I think that'd be the most effective place to start to get something usable, if that's our goal. Would figure out how to associate runs of text together in a pro-con, if that's the way we want to do it, or, you know, grouping that discussion about pros and cons, supports, opposes, or, and then also kind of grouping later on.
It raises the question of negation.
Yeah.
For me, that's fundamental there, because supporting and opposing that relationship changes depending on whether or not you want to support negation or not. And I don't think Carl was necessarily convinced on my idea of negation. I'm certain about that.
I think that needs to be a little more flexible, because if your system only allows for this is the claim, this is the anti-claim, or whatever, the negation, I just think there's more to it, right? Because there's many different runs of text, or whatever we want to call it, bare claims. But, I just for lack of just for ease, I'm gonna call it runs of text. There's many texts that are very similar, right? Like,
but not on Socrates. So I'm gonna preempt this, because I don't allow negations that are not exact negations.
Well, no, yeah, you do. You allow, and what I mean when I say that is that you allow negations that incorporate the negation into the text. You have both the parentheses not out front, but then you also have the text in there. And I guess I would have to look more closely to see if this ever does arise in ambiguity. But my opinion is that anytime you allow the free text part to be negated, then that may allow this possibility of there being ambiguity. So I don't know. Okay, let me think about that.
It is possible, but I avoid it with two things. One, that claims have to be atomic. There's no ands, etc., no os. Those are split up, so they're very. I forgot the name in logic, but like just entity property basically. And then the not simply gets added in that. It's from having added like over, I don't know how many a lot of claims on Socrates already. For me, it has never created ambiguity.
And this may be a little bit of like a Pollyanna, like I don't know if this would happen, but I'm also primarily an English speaker, and I know like one other language, like barely, like German, some, and some Spanish, like, but I don't know if this same circumstance would hold to all like linguistic forms in all situations where, and I think that a system we think of, I mean, I don't want to slow down progress because, oh my gosh, this one language can't handle this, but it would be nice to get someone who has some perspective and say, yeah, in all languages, like you're going to very easily be able to identify its negation. I don't know if there's like, linguistic participles that like sort of negate a sentence, but sort of don't. And so like, okay, there's this one version that's sort of negated with this participle, but then there's this one that's clearly, negated. And like, okay, so only allow this one in this language, or, do both need to be accounted for as soon as you incorporate this language in your system? Okay, this might be a bit of a,
it's an interesting point I didn't consider. So I am assuming English here.
Yeah.
And I think in Dutch it holds as well. In French, as far as I know, it holds as well.
It seems reasonable that it hold. I mean, it seems like a very basic human thing that, there's logical A and then there's not A. And that the language has a way to do that. But
it is a user interaction problem, though, because people very easily add things that I wouldn't allow as negations, and then that needs to be curated out. So the model I adopt does assume that it's curated, that they are exact negations.
What about this? What about, Michael Jordan is not tall versus Michael Jordan is short. Now, I mean, I know that those are definitely not negations, but I mean, in someone's head, they might be very confused by the concept. Like, well, of course that's a negation. Like, not tall means short. I don't know.
Yeah, that's one of the use. I observed that a lot in the users, and then I just had to point them out that that's a negation, and that's part of logic. Is pointing out the negations is also relevant, because if you're having a discussion whether it's tall or short, they're two separate discussions. They're two separate claims, and having them in one root node is not beneficial to that. It's not a, what's the word, dialectic? It's not a dialectic anymore.
So I guess I didn't, and maybe I've forgotten by now, why are we choosing to support the negation rather than saying disagreeing with the claim?
That's one, all I want to point out is that's an essential thing to point out if you just want a base model that is supporting and opposing.
It's
one of the main reasons of my experiment with Socrates was exploring that, because Kiala doesn't have negations, and actually oddly enough, no other system has negations.
Well, here, let me where's the example I provided? Like, you and I were chatting. Okay, so the UK Parliament won't pass Bill X. The UK Parliament plans not to pass Bill X. The UK okay, actually, forget the first one because won't pass the liver. The UK Parliament plans not to pass Bill X. The UK Parliament will decline to pass Bill X. Plans not to pass a bill and will decline to pass. To me, those are largely synonymous. I mean, if a system weren't to allow those to be merged, like in people's minds,
they can, but that's duplicate claims. So how I would model this is I would have two claims. You can say they're duplicates of one another, but they both have their phrasings and their negated phrasings. And you can always argue that they are pretty much essentially the same. You can say
who's going to decide that they're duplicate, though? Because if the system either allows these two claims are the same and then all arguments occur in them, or these two claims are not the same and they're going to be separate, then now you have an editorial part, which I mean may be okay.
But that's a curation bound context. So, but for a system to be useful where you want to achieve these canonical claims and where you want to reuse all these supporting and underlying, you will at some point need to deduplicate. My suggestion is that in a representation model, we just model it as duplicate. In a creation model, we introduce processes that log and vote, just like who decides on Stack Exchange whether or not a question gets closed, right? The mere fact is there's a representation that a question can be closed, and there's a whole curation process that you need 5 votes of people with more than X reputation to decide that it should be closed, etc. So for me, that's a separate process. But if we can already agree on a representation, disregarding whether or not we even agree that they're duplicate, we can say that that gets handled through a different system, then we're one step further. But yeah, so negation for me is very, very basic linguistic negation. Like the 3 ones you listed, they're 3 separate claims. They might be like through curation decided they're 3 duplicates and then get linked to each other as such. But there's still 3 standalone claims with a normal and a negated phrasing. But that's how I see it. That's by no means where we're at this point with CDL.
Yeah, so that's that. I was proposing that to be one of the priority discussions and clarifications without having to go into curation and everything else. Because you do have to choose a priority. You can't discuss everything all at once.
No, and I think if we can isolate curation actions like this from these discussions and simply, well, somebody has decided they are duplicates and that's what we want to represent, regardless of whether or not we believe that they are duplicates. So that's one way of sidestepping that discussion, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like to go for an even simpler use case. Although, I mean, everyone's saying it's there, but I still think we have some disagreement on that simplest use case. If I want to transfer a tree of, I mean, maybe we already have that, but I don't think so. I mean, like you were saying, if we're going to do pros and cons, do we need to settle the negation issue? Or can't you just say this string of text is a con to that string of text?
So if you want reuse, no, I can send you my format right now. And I mean,
why does that limit reuse?
I have the same, okay, yeah, if you only want the string of text and you don't want to know whether or not it's the same claim.
Yeah,
sure.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, there's no deduping, no nothing.
But that's not a challenge, right? I mean, it's simply just
it doesn't matter whether it's a
strings of
it's
text.
A challenge if we don't agree on it. Everyone keeps saying it's simple, but I don't think we agree on it yet. And we're building all this stuff on top of it, but we don't have the debate, the core. We don't have agreement on the core. Now you could tell me that it depends on all this stuff, but I'd like to see something.
It's a question of claim identity. The thing we're not agreeing on is the string of text the identity of the claim? And I'm saying no. For me, it's the tuple of the claim and its negation, and that influences how you want to mull all of that. If it's only the string of text, maybe it's I mean, we've talked about the two ways of mulling this, right? Is it two separate strings of text and you map a relation between them, or is it one entity that has two?
How are you going to assure that? Okay, so if there's a claim and it's negation, okay, so I'm allowing that negation. Let's say it's very straightforward, and there can be a there can be an easy curation process for people to determine. Okay, this one's a claim, this one's a negation, done. How are you going to? So if there are similar claims, like this claim here is like so close to this claim that they're equivalent, and it has a negation. How are you going to ensure that those all appear in the same place?
You don't.
That's going to be through another curation layer. That's going to okay. So 5 trusted users vote that this claim is equivalent. Okay, so now this claim and this claim are equivalent. Its negations therefore equivalent. They're all going to be combined in a single page of pros cons.
That's essentially why in a representation layer, it would be one entity that has multiple phrasings. I think we also talked about that at some point before you arrived. We talked about claims having multiple phrasings in the past. So rather than having the relationship between them to ensure within the representation layer easy linking and reuse, it would indeed be a claim with multiple phrasings, multiple negated phrasings.
And I think another option is to have a class of concept that we know will never be defined, and it has relationships to multiple strings of text.
What's the use case for this one? I'm not certain I can follow.
Well, it's useful in a lot of the use cases. So I don't know if I can think of a representative one. I mean, so like I want to see what other claims are similar to this one, that are different ways of phrasing the exact same thing. But instead of having them linked directly, the implementation uses a concept in between. So you have something. I guess I want to associate. I want to have I don't know how to think of it from a user, from a system standpoint. I want to have an object that represents the concept. I want to see multiple claims and see their relationship to a concept. Because some are better phrased than the other. So a string of text can relate to multiple concepts. Paris is nice could mean Paris is this, Paris is that. But instead of relating directly to the words, I want to pass through a concept so I can see all the relationships.
All Paris different concepts that use the same string of text, you mean?
Yeah, but also the relationship between that. This string of text could relate to Paris Hilton. What are the other claims about Paris Hilton? But without having not meaning the concept of Paris Hilton, but the concept of. But no, that's wrong. Sorry, ignore that. Yeah,
and I think the other use case you mentioned is a bit the general to specific relations we already somewhat intend to model, right? So
I don't.
Gallibot is not interested in general to specific.
No, I just think it's too detailed to. I'm not sure that it's practical.
I think the approach with the knowledge graph, not the knowledge graph, knowledge graph, right? I think Timothy wants to link to.
Yeah.
I don't believe in that one. For me, general to specific needs to be part of the base layer. And for me, the way I envision it is simply by adding context, right? It's like it's defined by the fact that there's additional pieces of information which define it. That's for me the only thing that matters. Whereas Timothy wants to link to an external source that provides the definitions and that provides the relationships between general and more specific definitions. I don't believe in that approach because basically, again, you can no longer argue against that external system. The whole point is that everything should be falsifiable.
Which you can argue. You can argue the link to the external system and say it should be linked here, or to a different external system.
Would you? I think Timothy wants one.
Well, he would say that we need to break that into a separate debate, because if you're pointing to Paris Hilton versus Paris France, those are two different debates.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in all cases, if you talk about what is nice, or if you talk about central Paris or external Paris, they're two different things. And then if you're linking, if you have those two same sentences linking to two different entities, and those entities have a hierarchical relationship within the knowledge graph, whether it's external or internal to the system, then you have a specific to general relationship that you can then model. But still, every time you have a general to specific, someone has to intentionally decide, does this change apply? Because even if it's a specific claim, that doesn't always apply to the general. If I'm talking about a certain area of France and I'm talking about an attribute of that doesn't apply to all of France.
Yeah, somebody has to decide, and that's
so
what
what's the use of having
adds it. And if you want to discuss whether or not it's relevant, you discuss whether or not it's relevant. I allow adding all of them, and it's basically through popularity and through voting and through adding underlying arguments that the best one wins. The most relevant one wins.
Yeah.
Because that's essentially what it is. The one that most people can agree with and that is most relevant is essentially the best abstraction, the best specificity to use. To me.
Yeah, but I thought you were saying they were all going to exist, so there is no best.
Sorry?
I thought you were saying that you wanted to have it to where they're immutable, so they're all going to exist.
Yeah. But if they are all going to, like, suppose somebody adds a more specific one. Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't mean that the most specific one is more useful. Like the Earth round is a nice example of that I brought up last time. Like, there's really no point in using the Earth round with fully defined, like, geometry, whatever the blah 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 ellipse. So I don't know the word anymore. There's no point in being more specific if the point you're making is something about flat earthers and whatever, right? You don't have to go in those details at that point in time. And there's merit in modeling it as such, or showing that there's large agreement in this case with that claim.
It just sounds like you're making Tim's argument against you for the last several meetings. So I guess I don't understand why you're going there.
I don't know
because he was saying I wanted to be able to retire certain runs of text because they are not useful. And you were just saying now I have a curation thing to where people can say that run of text is not.
Oh, but they both
disambiguated thing.
It's not curation. It's a popularity contest.
Well, that's one version of curation.
Not really, because all I've shown, the only difference
the point
is shown
the system has a way of hiding a claim.
People.
Okay, but I wasn't talking about how the claim is hidden. The point is you're saying that there are some claims that now you would like to have hidden. system runs attempts.
They're not hidden.
I mean,
they're
they'll still
visualized
exist,
differently. So I centralize
Yeah,
agreement. So what will happen
yeah.
is there will be less agreement on those. So the ones that people do agree on more are the ones that will surface.
But in Tim's system, there's always a history, and everything ever been done has been visual and can be linked to. So it sounds like y'all have been arguing violently or agreeing.
No, because one edits, the other one adds. That's a big difference.
But if you have a history, it's always an add. There's never an edit.
I thought Tim was arguing for mutability. And so, yeah, if you're saying that there's a history, I mean, a history is like a type of immutability, I suppose.
It's just a different way of expressing it. He still wants a full history and immutability in that way. He just wants it to be in the structure that we know
how does that work with
the most popular.
Okay, the earth is round. 5 people have voted that it's relevant. Somebody says, oh, but in this discussion, it's much more relevant to say the earth is an ellipsoid sphere or whatever. So they add that. What happens? Do these 5 votes of relevance, do you take them? I'm just saying these are 0. Somebody is claiming this is more relevant. Apparently there's some disagreement on the other one being irrelevant. Let's suppose 5 people find it relevant, the other 5 didn't. So it's 50-50. Now somebody adds a more specific version. No history. It's a separate claim. It's also a separate supporting claim. All of a sudden people are, this is much more relevant. There's no reason to believe this is not the case. What will happen is one of these 2 claims will become less relevant. It will show that there's less agreement on this being a relevant claim for the discussion. The other one, people will agree on more that it's relevant, depending on the conclusion. I can't come up with an example now, but it fully depends on the conclusion whether or not it's relevant. And sometimes the more ambiguous claim is the more useful claim. It depends on the context.
Right, but Tim was always saying that if you make a more specific claim, a lot of times that's divided into 2 debates, which is just a different way of saying what you're saying.
Yes. But he says both. Sometimes he says, I want to keep one. Other times says, I want to divide it. But the question is, how do you link them? What stays behind? And that's what I'm talking about.
Well,
one thing I've been thinking about is...
There's an assumption of a link, and there's a curation or crowdsourcing of it. So I think it's isometric. I think y'all are trying to do the same thing and just using different semantics.
Maybe.
One thing I've been thinking about is having a neutral polarity vote. So by polarity, I mean positive polarity means it's a pro, negative polarity, it's a con, justification. A neutral polarity justification, which is saying this particular, sentence is neither, true nor false. And one of the types of bases I'd like for that justification is because, this statement is much more useful for discussing this issue. So for Black Lives Matter, that neutral justification that says, the thing that Tim said earlier, there's systemic racism against, Blacks, and, they have disproportionately negative outcomes for similar circumstances by race. So it would be incorporated into the overall view on that particular claim on Black Lives Matter. But so, because it's a justification, but it's linking then to an alternative, alternative claim conversation. And it could be, upvoted, downvoted, ranked relative to other arguments that could be maybe about the merits of the particular claim. And that's something I've been thinking about as a way to bridge the gap between, alternatives or, alternatives and the actual pro-con argument.
I actually have mock-ups of that. I call it the it depends option. And then what you link to is what it depends on. I have some mock-ups of that. And I think the Ysaurus people actually implemented this recently in their system. Have you tried out Ysaurus yet, by the way?
I did at just an initial level. I loved how it could expand kind of forever, which allowed you to kind of keep, the large picture around. So that part I really liked. Because
I had a discussion with them about this exact use case, and we're exploring different designs. And it's eventually how, for me, I imagine indeed you vote, yes, I believe in this, I don't believe in this, or you say it depends. That's the option that is missing. A lot of my users also said, but what it's neither. And then the question is, why is it neither? And what I uncovered was the reason typically is because you believe in both. Let's take the Paris is nice example. Well, it depends. Is Paris a city or is it a person? You might have different opinions for both. And this is a weird example. If you don't think both Paris a city and Paris the person is nice, then you're going to say it depends on whether you're talking about the person or the city. So it basically means that you can't agree to the full claim if you don't agree to all the different interpretations. if you do agree with all different interpretations, meaning you find the abstraction, the ambiguous abstraction useful, those people will instantly say, yes, I believe in this. So what people that know more about the subject, typically they're more inclined to say it depends, and they can say what it depends on. And that would be the link indeed. And if a lot of people on a certain claim then start voting it depends, and they create the more specific versions, what you have is your link between the more specific versions. You have the general to specific relation without even modeling a general to specific relation. And that's what I'm aiming for. But I haven't implemented this yet, unfortunately.
So, and also, Carl, I think you were saying like whether something's pro or con, but yeah, I think you meant kind of just agreeing or not agreeing.
Sorry, what did you say, Bentley?
So you'd said something about voting whether something is pro or con.
I didn't mean voting whether it's pro or con. I think, a user enters a particular basis as a justification for some claim being true, false, or neutral. And then in my conception of things, people vote on whether that is an effective, proof of the thing being true, false, or, neutral, neither.
They combine it usually. It's both like, I think it's true and it's effective. That's the average layperson's like upvote on Kialo right now, essentially.
Yeah. Because we had some discussion saying, well, this phrase could be pro or con, depending on your interpretation of it. But what I'm saying is that when you enter in the system and you say it's a pro, you're claiming it's a pro. So people can disagree or agree with the whole statement of being the text and the fact that it's a pro, rather than I agree with that as a con. It's not something I want in the system. You put another one in and you disambiguate the two. And that's kind of one of the design
I have an example of being both a pro and a con that I always link to. It's in chat.
Yeah, well, it's not.
The climate change is man-made. Like global warming is man-made. It's not man-made. It's both a pro and a con in that one. It's the first one on the top. Which is another reason, by the way, why I want to support negations.
How do you mean it's a pro-con?
It's a pro and a con. Like on this page,
what is a pro as a con?
Global warming is man-made. Is a pro.
Well, it's negation.
Okay,
it's
no,
negation.
You're meaning that. You're linking the different use case where the same claim, not its negation, is both a pro and a con.
Yeah, well, people say, "Oh, this is a reason we should do this," and it's like, well, that's a reason we should not do it. But the whole point is they're ambiguous on what they want.
Yeah.
It's just ambiguous, and it has two interpretations.
Yeah, that's different.
But the two different interpretations have two different things. So when I make a claim and I say it's a pro, the interpretation of it being a con is not what I'm discussing here. That can be discussed elsewhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the relevance.
Right. Yeah, essentially. Anyway,
I started taking high level. Yeah, I have to too. I started taking like very high level notes, like 3 bullet points. Sorry, it's not more detailed, but if you want to add anything, I'll link it in the Hangouts right now.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, much appreciated. Some bookkeeping is bookkeeping. Do you call it bookkeeping?
Yeah, at least something. Yeah. Sorry, I'll try to remember to start next time sooner.
Maybe we should.
I like having these notes.
Those would also be better to post to social media rather than, because Felix was talking about us getting like smaller nuggets out that people might find on the internet.
We can try. I know that there can be some spam problems with Drive. I don't know, if they've addressed that recently or how we should worry about that. We can try it and see how it goes. But because these are open
even
to
copying
everyone,
and pasting them into tweet. I think it's read. Read on. I don't know if it's read only for its comment. I don't remember.
I think it's invite only, CDL, isn't it?
Anyone on the internet with this link can edit.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying right now. Can edit. We should probably change. Yeah, we should at least just to commenting, because that would be annoying if someone vandalized it.
But yeah, even just copying and pasting them, putting them up in it's too big for a tweet, but if you're taking the time of pulling it out, we could read it.
Anyone on the internet with this link can edit, sign in required.
Anyway, all right, guys. It was interesting.
All right,
it was.
Thanks.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye. Here, let me close this.